It was a bright Saturday morning when the sound of fake sirens echoed through the quiet neighborhood and people stepped out onto their porches confused and curious while one woman stood proudly at the center of it all with a smug smile stretching across her face because she was convinced justice was about to be served and rules would be restored. That woman was Karen Vessler, and she had called in her self-made squad of what she called HOA police to arrest the neighbor she hated most. She stood there waving her clipboard high in the air, declaring with full confidence that the black man across the street had broken so many community rules that he needed to be dragged away right now. Neighbors gasped and whispered while children clutched their parents' hands. And yet in the middle of this chaos, the accused man stepped onto his porch calm and unbothered with eyes that carried a weight no one else could understand. This was Cashin Holt, and in that moment the world was about to learn that the man Karen thought she could bully into submission was not just an ordinary neighbor but someone whose past made him more dangerous and powerful than anyone in that street could ever imagine. The fake police squad Karen assembled rolled up in an old van with magnetic stickers slapped on the doors to make it look official, but the uniforms were mismatched, and their badges looked like they were printed from a cheap office printer. Some neighbors tried not to laugh while others shook their heads in disbelief, but Karen treated them like a real force of authority, yelling orders and demanding they put Cashin in cuffs. Cashin just stood with his hands in his pockets staring at them with quiet amusement like a man watching children play dress-up. The leader of the fake squad nervously approached Cashin reading from a badly written script accusing him of not cutting his grass to regulation height and for parking his truck too close to the curb. Karen shouted that these were serious crimes and that the community demanded order. The absurdity of the moment was almost too much for the neighbors to process, and laughter began to ripple across the street. Cashin finally spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying across the lawn with surprising authority. He asked the so-called officer if he understood the risk of impersonating law enforcement. The man faltered and glanced nervously at Karen, who urged him to continue, but it was already too late. Something about the way Cashin looked at him made his knees weak, as though he was staring into the eyes of someone who had seen battles and lived through storms far beyond a suburban squabble. Cashin then took a single step forward, and the fake officer stumbled back, nearly dropping his fake badge. Karen screamed that they were losing control and demanded Cashin be restrained. Her voice cracked with frustration, but Cashin remained calm, almost detached, like he was waiting for something bigger to reveal itself. The neighborhood that once treated Cashin like a quiet stranger now began to whisper among themselves. Who was this man who faced humiliation and false arrest without even blinking? Why did the fake officers look more afraid of him than he was of them? Cashin finally turned to Karen and asked if this was truly what she wanted to do. If she wanted to push this ridiculous game into something serious. She shouted back that she would not allow rule breakers and freeloaders to destroy her community. Cashin gave a small smile, one that was both weary and dangerous, and then he said the words that silenced the entire street. He told her that if she wanted to play police, then she should understand she was not the first to come for him and certainly not the most dangerous. The tension in the air thickened, and even the children stopped whispering, sensing something in his voice that carried far more weight than anyone could imagine. The fake officers started backing away one by one, and Karen ran after them, waving her arms in desperation, but her authority was collapsing. Cashin walked down his porch steps slowly and deliberately, and each step felt like the ground itself was shifting. The neighbors parted like water as he passed through them, and there was an unspoken understanding that this man was not just another resident. He paused at the end of his driveway, looked back at Karen, and said he had been hunted before by men with real guns and real power, and that her little charade was nothing more than theater. The way he said it chilled Karen, who for the first time felt a crack in her confidence. She had no idea who she had been trying to intimidate, and the realization made her grip her clipboard tighter, as though it could protect her. Whispers grew louder as a few neighbors recalled seeing Cashin's name in a newspaper years ago, connected to dangerous fugitives and federal raids. Rumors spread like fire that he was not just some retired worker but something far more. Karen's face turned pale as she realized the man she had tried to frame for petty rule-breaking was once the most feared U.S. Marshal, a man whose very presence made hardened criminals tremble. Cashin did not confirm or deny the whispers. He simply turned and walked back to his porch, leaving Karen frozen in the street, with her fake police scrambling away. The spectacle was over, but the damage was done. Karen had tried to humiliate Cashin, and instead she had exposed herself as a fraud while awakening a truth about him that no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. That morning, which had begun with laughter and absurdity, ended in silence heavy with questions. Who really was Cashin Holt, and what had he done in his past to carry such unshakable strength? Karen promised herself she would not be defeated so easily. Her pride would not allow it. She retreated to her house furious and determined to find new ways to attack him, not realizing she had just started a war she could not possibly win. Cashin meanwhile sat quietly on his porch sipping his coffee as though nothing had happened, but inside he knew this neighborhood drama was about to turn into something far more dangerous than anyone expected. And so the stage was set with one foolish attempt at a fake arrest that backfired so badly it lit the spark for a storm that would consume them all. Cashin Holt had always lived with the heavy shadow of his past, and though he never spoke about it to his neighbors, the memories often rose inside him in the quiet of the night. After the scene with Karen and her fake police, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors about who he really was. Some said he had been a soldier, others claimed he was part of some secret agency, but only Cashin knew the truth of what he had been through. He was once a U.S. Marshal, not just any marshal but one of the most feared and respected in the entire force. His name carried weight in criminal circles because he was the man sent when the fugitives were too dangerous for others. He had seen the worst of humanity, tracked killers across deserts and jungles, stood face to face with cartel bosses, and survived ambushes that should have killed him. That life had carved him into a man with steel in his soul, but it had also left scars that no one could see. Years ago, Cashin had been part of a task force that hunted down a syndicate smuggling drugs and weapons into the country. The mission had been dangerous from the start, but what destroyed Cashin's faith was not the criminals he fought but the betrayal he suffered from the very people meant to have his back. A politician hungry for power had cut a deal with the syndicate behind closed doors, sacrificing Cashin's team to cover his own corruption. Cashin had watched good men die that day, men who had trusted him, men he could not save because someone in a suit far away had traded their lives for money. He carried that guilt with him even when he was cleared of all blame. The headlines had called him a hero, but in his heart he only felt the loss. That was the day he resigned, walking away from the Marshal's office and the life he had built. He wanted peace, he wanted silence, and he wanted to bury the ghosts that followed him. That is how he ended up in this quiet neighborhood where the loudest problem used to be barking dogs and overgrown hedges. But peace was always fragile for a man like Cashin. Karen Vessler represented everything he despised about petty power. She was loud, controlling, and convinced that the world revolved around her rules. In her mind, Cashin was a threat to her carefully crafted little kingdom because he refused to bow down or seek her approval. She told people his lawn was unkempt, his truck was too big, his presence too intimidating for their pristine community. She could not stand the way he ignored her demands because she thrived on control. For weeks before the fake police stunt, she had been stirring gossip, convincing the HOA board that Cashin was a dangerous influence. She warned them that he was hiding something, though she had no proof. Her lies were wrapped in confidence and delivered with the tone of a self-appointed queen, and some of the weaker neighbors believed her. But others had begun to doubt her after the fiasco with the fake arrest. They had seen Cashin's calm strength and compared it to her frantic desperation, and the difference was too clear to ignore. Cashin never sought to intimidate anyone in the neighborhood. He simply wanted to live quietly, tending to his tools, fixing up his truck, and sitting on his porch in the evening with his coffee. But the truth was he could never be ordinary, because his past had shaped him into something different. His eyes carried the memory of battlefields. His posture carried authority even when he tried to relax, and his silence spoke louder than most men's shouting. Children sensed it and treated him with cautious respect. Adults felt it too, though they could not explain why. They just knew Cashin Holt was not a man to cross. That was why Karen's attempt to humiliate him had backfired so badly. Instead of making him look weak, she had exposed her own foolishness while planting seeds of curiosity about the man she wanted to destroy. The more Karen obsessed over Cashin, the more determined she became to prove he was dangerous. She dug through county records looking for old arrests or convictions, but found nothing. She even drove past his house at night hoping to catch him doing something suspicious, though all she ever saw was him sitting quietly in the dark with a book or sharpening one of his old hunting knives. Her imagination twisted everything into a conspiracy. She told her closest allies in the HOA that Cashin must be hiding criminal friends or weapons. They laughed nervously because even they could sense she was reaching too far, but her intensity made them afraid to challenge her directly. Karen was like a storm that never stopped raging, and anyone who stood in her way was drowned in endless accusations. Cashin noticed her efforts but did not confront her. He had learned long ago that silence often unsettled enemies more than aggression. He allowed her to dig, allowed her to spread lies, because he knew in time she would hang herself with her own rope. But what worried him was not Karen's gossip but the strange visitors he began to notice in the neighborhood after the incident. A black SUV parked 2 streets down that did not belong to anyone who lived there. A man pretending to jog past his house 3 times in one day, though his breathing never showed the strain of running. Cashin's instincts sharpened, the instincts that had kept him alive through ambushes and betrayals. He knew surveillance when he saw it. Whoever they were not Karen's doing. She was too sloppy and too small-minded for that. This was something else, something bigger, and it stirred the old wariness in Cashin's chest. At night, he found himself replaying his past missions in his mind, trying to connect the dots. Had one of the criminals he put away finally tracked him down? He had locked up cartel bosses, killers, smugglers, and traitors, and he knew many of them had long memories. He had always wondered if leaving the Marshals meant leaving himself exposed. Maybe this was the day the past had finally come calling. He looked across the street at Karen's brightly lit house and almost smiled. She thought she was his greatest enemy, but she had no idea what real enemies looked like. Her fake police were nothing compared to the kind of men Cashin had faced. But she was still a problem because her obsession with him could easily drag her into waters too deep for her to swim. He almost felt pity for her, though her arrogance made pity difficult. That night Cashin stood on his porch staring at the black SUV that was once again parked 2 streets down. He could almost feel the eyes watching him through the tinted glass. He took a long sip of his coffee and felt the old weight return to his shoulders. He had wanted a peaceful life, but peace was never meant for men like him. Trouble had a way of finding him no matter how far he ran. As the wind rustled through the trees, Cashin whispered to himself that the storm was coming, and that when it arrived Karen would realize she had started a fight in a world she did not understand. The morning after the tense HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt different. There was a new tension in the air, as if everyone could feel the battle lines forming. Karen walked the street with her clipboard like a soldier on patrol, glaring at anyone who did not fall in line with her authority. She had always craved control, but now her obsession with Cashin consumed her every thought. She told anyone who would listen that he was dangerous and that the community needed to unite against him. Some neighbors avoided her because they were tired of her shouting, but others still listened and nodded quietly, not because they believed her but because they were afraid of her constant attacks. Cashin sat on his porch watching it unfold with the calm eyes of a man who had seen real war and understood that fear often made people follow the loudest voice, even if that voice led them to ruin. That week Karen called another HOA meeting, but this time she tried to turn it into a courtroom against Cashin. She presented her so-called evidence: photographs of his truck parked at odd hours, a video clip of him carrying a box into his garage, even a list of supposed violations that she had created herself. She announced that Cashin had to pay thousands in fines or face expulsion from the neighborhood. The room erupted with arguments as some neighbors shouted that Karen had no right to make such demands, while others nervously agreed with her, just to keep her from targeting them. Cashin sat in silence at the back until Karen pointed at him and demanded he defend himself. The room grew quiet, waiting for him to speak, but Cashin only smiled faintly and said there was nothing to defend because the rules she had written were not legal and her evidence proved nothing. He reminded them that impersonating police was a crime, and if they wanted to push further, he could just as easily call real law enforcement to look into her behavior. The crowd shifted nervously and Karen's face turned bright red with fury. She screamed that he was threatening her, but her words rang hollow compared to the calm, steady weight of Cashin's voice. That night Karen gathered her closest allies and whispered to them that Cashin had to be taken down no matter what it cost. She said he was dangerous and that if the HOA failed to act then she would take matters into her own hands. She talked about staging another sting operation, something more serious than the fake police stunt. Her allies were hesitant, but Karen was relentless. She convinced them to fund a private investigator to dig into Cashin's past. What she did not realize was that the investigator she hired had his own ties to the corrupt HOA president, and through that connection Cashin's name fell into darker hands. By the end of the week, men who had long hated Cashin Holt knew exactly where he lived. Meanwhile, the strange black SUV continued to appear and Cashin could feel the weight of being watched more heavily each day. His instincts told him danger was approaching, but he did not know from which direction. He sharpened his awareness, memorizing the movement of every car on his street, every face that walked past his house. He kept his weapons locked away but close enough to reach if he needed them. Neighbors who once saw him as quiet and distant now began to view him as a wall of strength. Some came to him privately asking if he could help push back against Karen. He did not commit, but he listened, and his quiet presence gave them courage. For the first time in years Cashin felt the stirrings of the protector inside him, the side of him that had once sworn to defend others at all costs. Karen launched her next attack by staging a surprise inspection of Cashin's property. She marched onto his lawn with 2 board members and shouted that she had authority to inspect for violations. Cashin stood in his driveway watching her tear through his garden and garage like a thief. He did not stop her because he wanted her arrogance to be witnessed by the neighbors who had gathered to watch. When she failed to find anything wrong, she accused him of hiding evidence and demanded he open his house. Cashin stepped forward and his shadow fell across her clipboard. His voice dropped low as he told her that if she crossed the line into his home, she would regret it in ways she could not imagine. Karen froze for a moment because the way he said it made the hair on her neck stand. She retreated in anger, but the crowd saw it as defeat. Whispers began spreading that Karen had finally gone too far. Days later, a new surprise shook the community. Late one night, the quiet street was disturbed by 3 masked men trying to break into Cashin's garage. What they did not know was that Cashin had been waiting. He had sensed they were coming long before they made their move. As they pried the lock, Cashin stepped from the shadows like a ghost, his voice cutting through the dark, telling them to leave while they still could. They turned on him with knives, but Cashin disarmed the first man with a single move, snapping the blade from his grip and sending him sprawling. The second swung wildly, but Cashin dodged with ease and dropped him with a hard strike. The third tried to run, but Cashin caught him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. He did not kill them or even seriously harm them. He just made it clear that he was not a man to be touched. The men fled stumbling into the night, but Cashin knew this was only the beginning. Someone had sent them, and he had a good guess who. The next morning, the entire street buzzed with stories of what had happened. Some neighbors claimed Cashin had fought off 5 men instead of 3. Others said he had weapons hidden in his house. Karen, however, twisted the story, saying Cashin had staged the attack himself to look like a hero. But her words rang hollow because people had seen the broken lock and the blood on the sidewalk. They had heard the screams in the night, and they could not deny that Cashin had defended himself with the skill of a trained fighter. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Neighbors who once followed Karen now started stepping back from her. Her grip on the HOA weakened, and her anger grew wild. She shouted louder than ever at meetings, accusing everyone of betrayal, but her voice no longer carried the same weight. Cashin remained silent through it all, but inside he was preparing. He knew Karen was not finished. He knew the men who had come to his house were only scouts, a test of his defenses. The real threat was still coming. As he sat on his porch with his coffee, he thought about the life he had left behind and the peace he had tried to build. He wondered if it had all been an illusion, because for men like him peace was always temporary. His instincts told him that Karen's petty war had opened the door to something far more dangerous, and that the storm was about to sweep through not just his house but the entire neighborhood. And though he had not wanted it, the protector inside him was awake again, ready for whatever came next. The quiet of the neighborhood was slowly unraveling, as if the walls of safety that once made people feel secure were being peeled back one by one. After the failed break-in attempt, Cashin spent his nights awake listening for every sound outside and watching the dark corners of the street where shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. He had lived with this feeling before during his years as a marshal when he hunted men who never forgot his face and never forgave him for putting them behind bars. That instinct of being hunted had returned, sharp and certain, and it told him something far bigger than Karen's petty crusade was taking shape around him. The black SUV still appeared on the edge of the street, but now there were new signs too. A drone buzzing briefly above his backyard before vanishing into the sky. A stranger walking his dog in the same pattern every night without ever changing direction. And the uneasy stares of men in suits who did not belong to suburban meetings yet showed up near the HOA office more often than chance allowed. Karen, meanwhile, was losing her grip on the neighborhood, but she did not care about the whispers against her because she had found new fuel for her obsession. Through the investigator she hired, she learned that Cashin Holt was indeed connected to the Marshal service. She did not understand the full depth of it, but the little she discovered was enough to convince her twisted mind that she had been right all along. Instead of realizing the danger of her discovery, she doubled down, convinced that Cashin was hiding dark secrets, and that exposing him would make her the hero of the community. She called her allies and showed them the thin file of information as though she had uncovered a bombshell. Most of them were unimpressed and some even walked away, tired of being pulled deeper into her madness. But Karen clung to the scraps like they were gold, and in doing so she unknowingly connected herself to forces far beyond her control. Cashin sensed it coming when he saw a man from his past walking through the grocery store parking lot near his neighborhood. The man's name was Dario Mendez, once a lieutenant in a cartel Cashin had helped dismantle years ago. Cashin had believed Mendez was locked away for decades, but seeing him free and walking casually through town told him something had gone wrong. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved, but in that silence Cashin knew the truth. The cartel had not forgotten him, and somehow they had found him again. Mendez gave a thin smile before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Cashin with the certainty that the storm he feared was already here. He drove home with his pulse steady but his mind racing, knowing that his past had finally collided with his present. That night Cashin pieced it together. The HOA president, a man named Grayson Locke, had always been distant and secretive, rarely seen except during official meetings where he spoke in rehearsed tones. Cashin had noticed the expensive suits, the polished car, and the visitors who came late at night to his house. Now it all clicked together. Locke was working with the same cartel Cashin had fought against. The neighborhood was more than just a suburban community, it was being used as a shell for money laundering and land manipulation. Karen, in her arrogance, had been unknowingly serving Locke's interests by keeping the community distracted with her personal crusade against Cashin. She thought she was fighting for order, but in truth, she was a pawn fueling corruption she could not comprehend. The realization settled heavily on Cashin because he knew what it meant. The cartel would not stop until he was removed. They had let him live quietly because they had not found him. But now, with Locke's connection and Karen's reckless digging, they had their eyes on him again. He understood the danger not just to himself but to the entire neighborhood. Families who thought their biggest worry was yard rules were living inside a battlefield without knowing it. Cashin had walked away from the Marshals to escape this life, but fate had dragged him back. And though he hated the weight of it, he could not turn his back on innocent people who would be crushed in the crossfire. Karen, however, refused to see any of it. She saw herself as the righteous warrior determined to expose Cashin's past. She barged into another HOA meeting waving papers and shouting that Cashin had been involved with violent criminals. She twisted the story, making it sound as if he had been on the wrong side of the law instead of the one enforcing it. Some gasped while others laughed at her theatrics, but Cashin remained silent, watching her spin lies with the desperation of someone losing control. He did not need to defend himself because the truth was far beyond her understanding. What unsettled him more was the way Locke sat quietly in the corner, eyes fixed on him with a cold recognition. Locke knew exactly who Cashin was, and Cashin knew in that moment that Locke was the link to the cartel. Their silent exchange said more than words could, and Cashin left the meeting knowing the time for peace was over. The following days grew darker. Strange cars parked closer to Cashin's house. His mail was tampered with, and one evening he found a mark carved into his fence, a symbol he recognized from his past hunts. It was the cartel's way of letting him know they were near. He cleaned his weapons and organized his home with the precision of a man preparing for war, but he also thought of the neighbors, the children who waved at him as they rode their bikes, the old couple next door who baked bread every Sunday, the young mother who trusted him enough to watch her son when she was late from work. He could not let them be caught in the storm. The protector inside him, the Marshal he had tried to bury, was alive again and ready to do what had to be done. Karen finally pushed too far when she broke into Cashin's yard one night with her phone camera rolling, determined to expose him. She stumbled upon evidence she did not understand. Papers Locke had planted that tied the HOA's financial accounts to offshore banks and shell companies. She thought it was proof of Cashin's corruption, but in truth it was evidence of Locke's cartel ties. She ran with the papers in triumph, shouting that she had finally won, not realizing she was carrying a death sentence in her hands. Locke's men saw her and followed her home, and for the first time Karen felt fear deeper than her arrogance could hide. For the first time Karen felt the cracks of doubt in her pride. She realized Cashin was not the villain she had painted him to be. He was something else, something far more powerful and terrifying, but also something strangely protective. Still, her stubbornness would not let her admit it out loud. She retreated into her house trembling and confused while Cashin walked back to his porch as if nothing had happened. But inside he knew this was only the beginning. Locke and the cartel would not stop. The shadows were closing in, and the quiet neighborhood was standing on the edge of a war it could not see. Cashin looked at the sky heavy with clouds and whispered to himself that the reckoning was near, and when it came the world would finally see the man Karen had tried to humiliate was not just a neighbor but the storm itself. The sky was dark with heavy clouds, as if nature itself knew something violent was about to break loose. The neighborhood that once looked like a safe and quiet place now felt like a stage for something dangerous and unstoppable. Cashin sat on his porch sipping coffee, but his mind was not calm. He had seen the signs too many times before, the silent cars waiting down the street, the strangers walking past with eyes that lingered too long, and the way Grayson Locke, the HOA president, had been moving with a cold confidence like a man backed by a force too powerful for ordinary people to question. Cashin knew this was the final stretch. The cartel had set its eyes on him, and once they made their move there would be no turning back. He had kept his weapons close, his senses sharp, and his resolve ready. He had not asked for this war, but it had come to his door, and he would not let it consume the innocent families who had nothing to do with it. Karen, meanwhile, had locked herself inside her house, clutching the papers she had stolen. Her arrogance broken by the memory of the cartel men who came for her. For the first time she felt the real danger of what she had stirred. She had wanted to humiliate Cashin and prove herself right, but now she realized she had placed herself at the center of something deadly. Her pride wrestled with her fear, but the truth she could not ignore was that Cashin had saved her when no one else could. She sat in the dark, staring at her reflection in the window, wondering how she had let her obsession blind her so completely. Yet even with that realization, her nature would not let her admit defeat. She told herself that once the storm ended, she would spin the story in her favor. But deep inside she knew that for the first time she had met someone far beyond her reach. The night of reckoning came when Locke finally made his move. The cartel needed Cashin gone, and Locke wanted to erase the threat of exposure from Karen's stolen documents. They decided to strike with a mix of cartel muscle and the private security Locke controlled. Around midnight, black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood, shutting off their headlights as they slid silently into position. Men stepped out armed with weapons that did not belong anywhere near a suburban street. Their plan was to storm Cashin's house, silence him, and retrieve whatever evidence Karen might still have. But what they did not understand was that Cashin had been waiting for them. He had lived through too many ambushes to be caught off guard. Long before their engines cooled, he was already in motion, moving through his home with practiced precision, locking the doors, setting signals, and preparing for the inevitable clash. The first team approached his porch with weapons raised, but Cashin slipped out the back and came around behind them like a shadow. With the silence of a predator he struck, disarming one man and dropping another with a swift blow that left him gasping on the ground. Before the others could react, he vanished again into the darkness, leaving them shaken and unsure of how many men they were truly facing. Panic spread quickly because Cashin did not fight like an ordinary man. He fought like the storm itself. Every move was sharp, precise, and devastating. The neighborhood that had once been Karen's kingdom now echoed with the sounds of a battle none of them could have imagined. Dogs barked, windows lit up, and terrified neighbors peered through blinds as the quiet street turned into a war zone. At the same time, Karen's house became the second target. Two cartel men forced their way in, expecting an easy grab, but found Karen screaming and throwing anything she could reach at them. Before they could silence her, Cashin appeared at the doorway, his presence filling the room like thunder. He moved faster than their eyes could follow, disarming one with a brutal twist and sending the other crashing into the wall. Karen stood frozen, clutching the papers as Cashin told her firmly to stay quiet and stay down. For the first time she obeyed without argument because she finally understood she was standing in the presence of someone who commanded respect in ways her false authority never could. He grabbed the papers from her shaking hands and tucked them into his jacket, knowing they were the final piece of proof he needed. Locke, meanwhile, was at the HOA office monitoring everything through a secure line. He was confident Cashin would be eliminated, but as the reports came in about his men failing one after another, his calm began to crack. He had underestimated the man he was facing, and now fear gripped him. He called the cartel boss demanding reinforcements, but the voice on the other end told him bluntly that if he could not handle one man, then he was of no use to them. For the first time, Locke realized he was just another expendable pawn, and panic consumed him. He decided to flee, but by then it was already too late because Cashin was coming for him. The fight on the street reached its peak as more cartel enforcers tried to push into Cashin's house, only to be met with a resistance they could not comprehend. Cashin used every skill he had learned over years of hunting the worst criminals. He moved through the chaos with steady calm, disarming, striking, and dismantling his enemies one by one. He never wasted energy, never gave in to fear, and never allowed them to gain control. Neighbors watched in awe and terror as this man who had once seemed so quiet revealed the truth of who he was. The most feared U.S. Marshal was no myth. He was standing right in front of them, protecting their homes from men who would have destroyed everything. When the last of the gunmen fell back defeated, Cashin did not stop. He knew Locke was the key, and that leaving him alive with power would only invite the storm to return. He moved swiftly to the HOA office where Locke was frantically trying to erase files from his computer. The door burst open and Locke spun around only to find himself face to face with the man he had tried to erase. Cashin walked toward him slowly and Locke backed up until his legs hit the desk. Cashin placed the stolen papers on the table and told him calmly that it was over. Locke tried to beg, tried to explain, but Cashin's eyes silenced him. He told Locke that the cartel would never protect him now, that the evidence was enough to bury him, and that the law was already closing in. Locke collapsed into his chair, shaking. His empire of control shattered in a single night. When the dust settled, Cashin returned to his porch. The neighborhood was safe again, but he knew peace would always be fragile for him. He was marked by his past, a man who carried storms wherever he went. Yet as he sipped his coffee, he also felt a strange sense of closure. The ghosts that had haunted him had finally faced him once more, and he had not backed down. He had protected the innocent and exposed the corrupt, just as he had always done. The neighbors who once saw him as distant now greeted him with quiet respect, and though Karen still hovered at the edge of her pride, she no longer dared to challenge him. She knew the truth, as they all did. Cashin Holt was not just a neighbor, not just a man living in quiet retirement. He was the most feared U.S. Marshal, and when the storm came, he stood unshaken.